Alrighty, I thought this might just be a little fun. So Method put out this little post about all the dungeon and raid trinkets for Dragonflight, and I thought, you know what? Let's do some speculation on what the warrior trinkets might be before the robot tells me what's best, and then 2 months later, someone fixes the robot and it tells me something else is better. So let's have some fun before all of that happens, right? So first and foremost, we're going to be looking at the raid trinkets. Strength trinket on use. Summon 4 roots of drawing their power, 15 seconds, slowing you by 15%, so 60% slow. Your next 4 melee abilities each sever a root, dealing 70k additional Shadow Flame damage split between nearby enemies. Damage increased per enemy struck up to 5. 2.5 minute cooldown. For Warrior, I don't really like 2.5 minutes. I'm really looking for something that's like 1.5 to 2 at most. And if it's an on use, I want it to really be damage or something good for a single target. It looks interesting, and as Warrior, we're going to be able to break these tethers pretty quickly, but I don't know, it just doesn't seem very interesting. I hope it's not very good. I don't think it's very good. Just from looking at it. So, who knows? Might be better, but this one it doesn't inspire me at all, you know? Coiled Serpent Idol. Your critical strikes have a chance to summon a lava serpent that attacks your target for 10 seconds. The serpent spews a lava bolt every 2 seconds, dealing X volcanic damage every third. Call for 3 serpents instead. If the target dies, the serpent enrages to deal volcanic damage to all 8 nearby enemies. This one, I actually think this was kind of cool. I like the idea that you're summoning these little guys and they're attacking your target. But if you kill your target, it does a big AOE spread. I don't know how it works with cleaved abilities. I don't know exactly how it works. It'll probably target your target. But either spec of Warrior is going to do a significant amount of crits. I don't know the internal cooldown of this. But honestly, this one looks kind of fun. And this might be something worth using. I like little effects like these that are kind of cool. And the AoE implication of it as well, especially in something like Mythic Plus, might be pretty good. Like, imagine you do a 3 summon, and then you kill, and they're targeting like a little mob, and then that little mob dies over that 10-second period. Then they all go, brah, and it does a big 45k to everything base. Because it doesn't say the damage is split, it just says it does flat damage. Although nearby enemies, if you're kiting stuff, who knows if it's going to be good. But I like this one. I like it. Just in the idea that I don't know if it'll be good, but I like it. I'm also a big fan of passive trinkets too. Pip's Emerald Friendship Badge. This is the stat stick, kind of like the previous Vault of Whispering Incarnate Icon or the Ominous Chromatic Essence. However, it is a little different compared to those two. Join the Dream Team, gaining a bunch of Pip's mastery, versatility, or crit based on your current best friend. Your spells and abilities have a chance to tag a new best friend, guaranteeing you their bonus and empowering it to X amount before diminishing over 12 seconds. 12-second cooldown. So you're basically just rotating abilities or rotating stats, which I have someone... Honestly, the reason why I'm interested in something more like this than this is in the upcoming season, I'm honestly not very... I'm very weird on how stats are going to be. We're already hitting multiple soft caps on stats like haste and mastery, on like 2 stats if we're kind of focusing on them towards gearing. So something else that's going to be pushing us already above that cap, and with the higher item level, we're easily going to be hitting these caps. Because even though I like something like Burst, Mastery, and Crit are all things that are decent for like Fury, for example, it's going to overcap, it's going to get diminishing returns on it. It could be pretty strong. I think the versatility in particular is probably pretty good, especially for like a Mythic Plus context, since it's just raw stats for doing AoE is good. So it could be one of our best items, but with how we're hitting soft caps, I'm not sure how much I actually like it. But if we're focusing, let's say, haste mastery and then using something like verse as our dump stat and then having the crit from our base crit, random crit from gear, plus maybe this kind of crit, adding that additional crit to something like our tier sets where we're trying to crit as much as we can, might be good, but stat sticks are good, but I'm kind of bored of them. We've had these a big stat stick every tier, and every tier it's best. So I don't think it's going to change any with this one. However, to note about this this stat stick is that the buffs you're getting are going to be different. They're going to be rotating around a lot. On top of, they're also going to be diminishing. But Warrior is a pretty evenly throughput class. Theory does have a decent burst window, but regardless of that, this will probably be very good, but kind of bored of stat stick trinkets. But if it's the best, you'll wear it because it's the best. Moving on, Cataclysmic Signet Brand. Your melee attacks and abilities have a chance to viciously brand your target, dealing damage over time and granting Fire Starter. Stacks it to 15 times. Damage increases per stack to a maximum of X amount of damage. While above 5 stacks, also deal 50% of its damage to you. At 15 stacks, enemy near your target suffer 10% of the damage dealt split between them. Firestarter decays every 5 seconds while out of combat and fades entirely after 15 seconds. This is another one of those passive trinkets that I think is interesting. It has a Mythic Plus application where, especially if you're chain pulling, that you're really just chugging damage into enemies. We all have a lot of base survivability. Warrior is a very tanky class, especially Fury. The amount of leech we have, the amount of leech we might be getting from, if we're playing armed, something like Fueled by Violence, now that they've removed the Ignore Pain change, or just the amount of flat leech we're getting from Fury and from Pain and Gain, and we have Impending Victory. So the damage that we would be reflecting might not matter that much. But if you're able to keep up chain pulls and you're really doing a ton of damage with this thing, it might be pretty cool. But there's a lot of other effects in the raid that do self-damage, and at a certain point, I wonder if that's kind of why they nerfed some of the... They actually increased the amount of damage you take from Shadow Flame patch. So I wonder, with all of these kinds of items, plus something like the crit vial that we might be using, we might just literally be killing ourselves in a fucking fight. So it might be too much. I do like it. I do think it's interesting. I think it does have a good amount of applications in something like Mythic Plus as well, which I think would be super cool. The only thing I do hope is that it says attacks have to brand your target. I'm kind of hoping that if we're cleaving, this also cleaves onto other targets too, not just the primary target. But, you know, we'll see what it does. Ashes of another one for Smolderon. Draw power from the Ember Soul, gaining primary stat, decaying over 20 seconds. Once this effect and become burned out, losing haste before recovering. When circumstances are dire, your soul ignites, granting this bonus again without decaying. This effect may only occur once per combat. The problem with this is I don't know what this means. I don't know if anybody knows what this means. When circumstances are dire, your soul ignites, granting the bonus again without decaying. Because, like, it might be something very... Here's the thing. This thing might be good. I have talked about us stat capping, but the fact that it gives you a bunch of primary stat that doesn't decay for 20 seconds, maybe using all of this self-damage shit, letting yourself get low, and then your healer somehow is like, alright, I'll wait till it procs on you, and then I'll heal you up. I don't know. That's not really realistic in most situations. But there could be some interesting potential there. However, it's a haste-based stat. I prefer main stat for stuff like that. It might have its uses, but I don't think it's going to be too crazy. especially considering that after you use the on use of this thing, even though you might have a big burst window, an entire minute of essentially a dead trinket that doesn't do anything kind of sucks, especially if you're looking to push. But if you're overcapped on haste, maybe it won't matter that much. So we'll have to see. Intellect, Fire Axe, Tainted Rage Heart. Deal Shadow Flame damage to you and nearby enemies every 3 seconds while in combat. Give in to the Rage Heart, absorbing damage but suffering Shadow Flame damage and lashing out at enemies every 2 seconds. Deal damage split between nearby enemies. Damage is increased per enemy struck up to 5. Minute 30 cooldown, kind of interesting. It is also a very rare trinket from Fire Axe, so it's going to have a higher item level. It could be pretty good just as a static damage trinket, just for everything. It is seemingly uncapped, which is kind of nice. I don't know if it's equipped damage scales with versatility. It could be good. I think it has potential, and the fact that it's a verse trinket is a stat we're probably not going to be primarily focusing. Could be interesting, but this is realistically, at least the idea of it, at least, is certainly pushed more towards tanks. I think because of the minute 30 cooldown on top of Avatar with something like Warrior might be a good like Warrior tank trinket. But I don't think it's going to be good enough for a DPS to want to actually equip this, unless unless maybe it's like a Mythic Plus kind of thing. Not sure, but it's probably not going to be super crazy. This thing, however, it's crit, which is something that Arms and Fury are both going to want. Your spells and abilities have a low chance of granting Annihilating Flame for 20 seconds, causing your critical strikes to deal 50% additional damage as fire split between nearby enemies. Just damage to everything. That's cool. The flame may deal X amount total damage before fading, further increased by critical strikes. Damage and cap increased per enemy struck up to 5. So this is just, it's a passive, it's a crit trinket, and it's just doing damn and doing damn to everything. The damage is split, so it's not like you're going to be doing a crazy amount of spread cleave with this thing. But once again, it is a Fire Axe trinket, so it is going to be very high item level, going to have a lot of crit, and if the effect has a static damage passive, this is something that's potentially, I'd say is probably potentially pretty good as that's something that might definitely be really good for Fury, just because we're probably going to want a little extra crit on top of mainly focusing on haste mastery gear. It's probably good for Arms too, since with the buff back to crafted items, your jewelry is going to be able to be tuned to however you feel like it, since it has no primary stat. Most likely you'll be wearing a necklace and 2 rings of crafted value. There are, interestingly enough, in the raid a haste mastery ring and a haste mastery necklace. One is main stat mastery, the other is main stat haste at a very imbalanced value. But wearing both of those, and they're both raid level trinket or accessories, might be the play for, at least for Fury, since they kind of balance each other out in terms of their stats. But this trinket, I think, is interesting. I kind of hope it's good. A trinket off of the last boss that's also a rare drop would be pretty good, and I hope it's good. And I think it'd be very interesting wearing it as well. And because it's your crit strikes deal 50% additional damage as fire, you're going to be doing a lot of crits, and this thing could be doing crazy amounts of damage in those 20-second windows that you get. And with Fury pushing a lot of buttons and looking pretty decent, I'm kind of hopeful. Imagine going into a pack and Odin's Furying and you're just cleaving up. Oh, it might be pretty good. Might be pretty cool. And we have defensive trinkets. Gift of the Earth Sign. Swipe at the nearby enemy. For physical damage, you gain a stack of Rising Rage whenever you or an ally takes damage, granting primary stats, stacking up. This effect may occur every 30 seconds. At 30 stacks, gain Fury of Urktos for 8 seconds before consuming them, counterattacking all blows and regenerating health. This is realistically a tank trinket, and It is a counterattack, so it probably has to something as a hit you to proc it. Not really something we're going to be looking for. So not something that's very interesting. We're not going to look at the healing trinkets because we don't care. Now we have a lot of interesting trinkets here. I think these are primarily damage dealing trinkets from the Mythic Plus pool. And to note, we're going to be having the Dawn of the Infinite trinkets, which are probably going to be very sought after, especially the tank trinket is going to be incredibly sought after at the time. So expect to run this a lot with you and your friends, and expect to get some good shit out of there. Because there's also interesting weapons and items that come there too. Let's look at the trinkets. Versatility. Envelop an ally in protection, absorbing damage. If the protection is fully consumed, the ally gains verse. This is something no one's probably really going to use. It has an interesting effect that could have a niche application, but realistically, this isn't something we're going to use. This isn't something tanks are going to use. Spores of Alacrity. Inhale the spores, granting haste that decays over 20 seconds, 2-minute cooldown. This could be interesting, but one of the issues is we are obviously a 1.5-minute class, not a 2-minute class. Because of this, we will be desyncing our trinket with our main cooldown abilities. Not to mention, it is going to be giving us a significant amount of haste. We are most likely, as Arms or Fury, building a ton of haste baseline, so that the fact that this thing is going to be overcapping us and DRing significantly on top of not stacking with our 1.5-minute cooldowns is probably something we're not really going to be looking for and not really going to be interested in. Stamina Trinket. Taking damage as a chance to call Brood to your aid, attacking your foes and covering you. Protective webbing. This thing might be sneakily good. If you can get this, and you pick this up and nobody wants it, hold one of these in your back pocket. Because this thing's going to give you a ton of health and survivability. And sometimes, depending on the situation, trinkets, are mainly for damage. But having something like this, depending on what you're doing, could be the difference maker. If you just need to live. And there are situations where sometimes you just need to live. So this might actually be something that if you're running the Everbloom, you might want to swap over to Prospect, because having a little one of these in your back pocket while you realistically won't be using it might be a nice tool to have. Now we'll move over to the Blackrook Hold. The spiked counterweight. Your melee attacks have a chance to deal physical damage and increase the damage the target takes from you by 15% for 15 seconds, up to X amount of extra damage. This is once again a haste-based trinket, which, if we're using crafted pieces, having a secondary stat, not a primary stat trinket is fine. It is a passive trinket, which I like, and it will just overall increase your throughput and damage on a target. And depending on when this is applied, sometimes you might get a little extra bonus from this. Though the damage effect does have a cap on it with a 15-second cooldown. So realistically, could be good, could be a nice passive trinket, something to pick up early on, but realistically, I don't think this is going to be something that we're going to be pining for, mainly because, like I said, both specs use haste in a very significant manner, and because of that, we're going to be overcapping and would probably prefer a primary stat trinket comparatively. Mastery. Your range attacks and spells, not applicable to us. Your damaging spells, not applicable to us. Versatility, your ranged attacks and spells now deal shadow damage and reduce, not applicable to us. Nightmare Shell, your melee attacks have a chance to infuse with Nightmare Winds, granting you haste every 1 second for 20 seconds. Once again, it is a primary stat trinket that does give secondary stat. Might be interesting, could be decent, especially if you pick something up at a high item level like this early. It's probably not too bad, but once again, along the sides of everything else, I'm kind of leaning more towards damage trinkets comparatively, even passive damage trinkets comparatively to, or primary stat on uses comparatively to secondary stat applications on my trinkets going into the next patch, just because of the the caps we might be hitting in terms of wasting stats. Realistically, something like this potentially could be way better than how I think and might be best, but I don't know. Just doesn't seem too interesting to me. Aldazar Agi, Aldazar. This used to be, I think, like a haste trinket or something like that. I don't remember what this originally was, but I like the new version of it. Primary stat trinket, your damaging abilities have a chance to call the child of Razan to viciously rend your target, dealing physical damage and causing them to bleed. We already do a decent amount of bleed damage. We do physical damage. It is a primary stat trinket that just does damage. I don't know if this ability cleaves. Like, I don't know if the little guys cleave or if they're only on the single target. But this has potential. I think this has pretty good potential. It might be pretty good. Could do a decent amount of damage. We have a lot of, especially when we get the Helm enchant, I think after 5 weeks, just doing flat damage to everything. Could be really, really good. It might be something worth looking for in your vault and something worth farming for. Especially early on, getting trinkets that just do good damn is nice to have. So this is definitely one to look out for. Intellect we don't use. Gore-crusted Butcher's Block. Your attacks have a chance to grant you critical strike. I've already talked about how I feel about potential stats next tier. This is something that may be more interesting for Fury rather than for Arms. Fury's probably still going to go the Haste Mastery route with a little bit of Verse, and Crit won't be our primary target of focus, especially considering we're taking talents that increase the critical strike of our Bloodthirsts. Having a little extra crit as we're just doing stuff normally to reduce the cooldowns of Odin's Fury is probably going to be pretty good, so this has a decent amount of potential for Fury. For Arms, we're already really looking and have been haste crit for a while. So having something that is just even more crit, maybe you can recraft some stuff into Mastery, maybe get Mastery pieces in the raid instead to kind of balance it out. But for Arms, I don't know how I feel about stacking more and more crit. At a certain point, it's just not, obviously, it's just not worth it at a certain point. Once you start hitting those caps, once you start getting even closer to 50%, our secondary stats are going to be very high. So while this does look interesting, especially as a passive trinket, I don't think it's going to be something that's nearly as wanted for us. But once again, all speculation, could be wrong. I have heard this trinket could be nuts for casters, but I don't know. So we'll see. This trinket is just you're just getting a bunch of haste. It is just a haste trinket, which could be good, especially since we do a lot of attacks as Fury. This is something I even use currently for AoE in my Mythic Plus setup. This trinket early on is going to be very, very good and very, very strong. Highly recommend to go for it. However, basically, Dawn of the Infinite, your raiders are going to be wanting to go in here, especially for shit like the Time Strike Dagger, the Time Strike Warglaive. There's different guns. There's a staff with a special effect. Dawn of the Infinite's going to have a lot of crazy good loot. Even this item that gives you of your highest secondary stat, which in a burst window situation could be good. But like I said, I'm not really too interested in these secondary stat trinkets. If they're the best, and I'll use them. But I'm not too interested in them. But Sandglass as a static, increasing your haste kind of thing could be pretty interesting. Not really interesting, it just could be good. Especially since the Dawn trinkets have seemed pretty good throughout their use. But once again, since we are hitting those caps, it might be good, but it might not be the best thing either. But as always, this is something that's going to be pretty damn good to get early on. So while you're farming it, have some fun. Porcelain Crab, you're interested. So it's not dodge, it's going to be verse. Your melee attacks have a chance to shred a limb, gaining mastery and avoidance. This, that as an effect might actually be interesting, because it does give you avoidance, it'll give you verse, and it'll give you mastery, which is generally pretty good. As far as the trinket that might be useful in like a prog setting, which is just like, hey, little more chance to live. It'll give you avoidance for all that AoE damage. It might just be a nice defensive trinket to have if you pick it up early. But it's probably not something you're going to be really running, especially as DPS, just because you're trying to do the most damage you can. But like the egg we talked about earlier, that was stem, might have some applications, and something that gives you static verse as we're getting tapped on other stats, but it does give you mastery and avoidance. Could be something nice for like a Mythic Plus setting. We'll have to see. We'll have to see. So it has potential. This one, however, this one might be pretty good. Especially as, honestly, even inferior arms. I know I have so far talked about how secondary stat trinkets base might not be very good, and once again, that has the possibility here. However, the fact that this trinket is granting you primary stat on a 130 cooldown so you can pair it with your avatar every single time might be our best trinket in the game. Just because it pairs with our cooldowns. It might be really, really strong. So if you're farming stuff and you get thrown to the tides, definitely try and get this. Ask your teammates to try and get this for you. I think this might be one of our best trinkets throughout the entire season. I could be wrong. However, I think it has a massive amount of potential. It's just because of its cooldown timer alongside our cooldowns. And to note, since we are playing Reckless Abandon on Fury instead of AM, or at least that's what we're looking at currently, this double goes for us, considering that we are purely in a 130 window outside of potential 4-second recklessness procs through our rampage. This thing is probably going to be big number for everybody, and unlike the vial from this tier that gives you a strength proc that subcedes, this thing is a static proc, and it will be up for your entire burst window, especially in like a Mythic Plus pool. I am really looking forward to getting this trinket. I'm probably going to target farm it if I can, because it is most likely going to be very, very, very strong. Because just because of how everything works now. And even for arms, if we're still, as arms is running Test of Might still from the looks of things, bonus strength still contributes towards that Test of Might bonus. Not to mention, arms still likes crit, and the 1 minute 30 goes with our other cooldowns, so it's looking pretty good for everything. Definitely keep an eye out for this thing, and I would focus farm this. This is probably one of the main things I would focus farm personally. Healing trinkets and defensive trinkets. We have talked about this. And something that is, I think, potentially interesting too. If you get multiple of these, like you're probably going to be rolling prot for your tank anyway. But if you actually can get multiple of these, even though this doesn't provide you a actual damage benefit, depending on how this works, because it gives base strength, much like a cheat death that a rogue or a hunter or an invulnerability would be used, you might be able to cheese a fucking mechanic with this thing. I don't know exactly how its cheat death works. I don't know if it can be overcapped. Like right now, currently, if you have a cheat death, like a rogue's cheat death, yeah, it's a cheat death, but if the cheat does more than, I think, like double your health or something like that, you just die straight through the cheat. You don't cheat. This thing might be different in that regard, and it resets on pull. So because of that, in a prog scenario, if you already got your tank this trinket, this might be something interesting to hold on to and use. And depending on what you might be using with it, could actually cheese a mechanic or two. I haven't really looked at all of the raid mechanics personally, so I don't know if there's any mechanics worth cheesing with something like this. But regardless, a primary stat cheat death trinket is pretty damn good, and has always been really damn good. Not to mention, you do get haste when you res as well, and it gives you a lot of health back, so something to really look out for. Even though it doesn't do damage, this could be pretty juice for all Agi and Strength users, just as a backup, especially in a prog setting, if damage is not the issue. Oh, well, that was longer. Honestly, longer than I expected, but I think it was kind of fun going through and talking about these. There are some interesting things that we have for potential. Some things like the Might of the Ocean, which I think are going to be guaranteed very strong for us just because of its cooldown time. But who knows? Maybe we're running double passive, and that's the best bet. We'll have to see. We'll let the robot do the work, but for now, that was my speculatory 10.2 DPS Warrior Trinket overview. Hope you had fun, because I had fun. I like talking about this shit. Anyway, have a good one. Peace.